I'm a 32-year-old woman, and 3 years ago, my husband Luke and I moved into a small 2-bedroom starter home on a quiet tree-lined street. We were thrilled to finally have a place of our own, even if it was a little cramped and needed more work than we first realized. Luke's mother, Margaret, greeted our new beginning with a warm smile and a casserole dish in hand. She came by with small household gifts, kitchen towels, a set of mugs, a bag of fresh apples, and seemed genuinely excited for us. Margaret had a habit that felt quirky at first. Whenever we split groceries after a family dinner or went in together on party supplies, she jotted the amount in a small floral-covered notebook. I noticed it the first week we moved in, when she helped stock our pantry and paused to write Emma, 18.45 next to a neat column of dates. It struck me as charmingly precise, like she just liked keeping life tidy. About 2 months later, our water heater died. We were still juggling furniture costs and couldn't spare the money right away. Margaret insisted on calling a repair service and paying for it herself, waving off our protests. She smiled and said it was a housewarming present. When she left, though, I caught the glint of her pen as she scribbled something into the little notebook before sliding it back into her purse. Weeks passed. We were at a Sunday dinner when she mentioned, almost casually, that we could settle up for the plumbing bill whenever convenient. My fork paused halfway to my mouth. That gift had quietly turned into a loan. Luke brushed it off, saying his mom just liked keeping records and probably misspoke. It didn't stop there. Over the next 2 years, Margaret often offered to cover small extras, birthday candles, spare diapers, a bit of siding repair, always smiling as she reached for her wallet, and always, I noticed, making a quick note afterward. It became a pattern so steady I could predict it. The offer, the cheerful acceptance of thanks, and the careful recording. Sunday dinners started to feel like hidden account reviews. Margaret would chat about recipes or neighborhood news, then weave in a reminder of something she'd helped with, phrased lightly but always there. Luke told me I was overthinking it. She's just detail-oriented, he'd say while clearing plates. When our daughter Lily was born, Margaret's enthusiasm ramped up. She offered regular babysitting so I could finish a remote contract project. At first it was a blessing, free childcare from someone Lily adored. But one afternoon, as I walked past the guest room to grab a fresh diaper, I overheard her on the phone. "I'm tallying the hours," she said, a quiet pride in her voice. A few days later, I bought a new stroller with a bonus from my project. Margaret watched me unpack it and remarked that it might have been wiser to repay that plumbing loan first. The air between us chilled. Not long after, I was unloading groceries in her kitchen when a binder on the counter caught my eye. A thick 3-ring binder labeled in bold marker, "Family Assistance, Emma and Luke." Curiosity prickled. I flipped it open to neat color-coded tabs. Every page listed dates, items, and exact amounts down to the cent. Formula, $24.99. Stroller snacks, $8.15. Even the water heater repair, highlighted in yellow. I closed the binder before she returned but couldn't unsee it. That night, I started my own spreadsheet. If she wanted to track every dollar, I would track every hour she spent babysitting. I logged each visit, the market rate for childcare, and even the times she requested extra help. The numbers climbed quickly. By the time Lily's 3rd birthday rolled around, the tension was hard to ignore. Family gatherings felt like quiet scorecards. Margaret's smiles were pleasant but tight, her glances lingering on every new purchase in our house. Luke finally admitted he sensed it too, though he still hoped it would blow over. I wasn't so sure. The binder in her kitchen told me this wasn't just quirky bookkeeping. It was a ledger, one she expected to settle someday. And with every careful entry, the pressure in our little family kept building, one silent calculation at a time. I'm a 32-year-old woman, and Lily's 3rd birthday started like any other cheerful family gathering. Our small house smelled of frosting and warm bread as relatives filled the living room with wrapped gifts and camera flashes. Luke strung balloons across the doorway while I set cupcakes on the table. Margaret arrived last, carrying a bakery box in one hand and a pale pink envelope in the other. The envelope had neat block letters across the front, family balances. I noticed it when she placed the cake on the counter and slid the envelope beside the paper plates. My stomach tightened, but I focused on welcoming the guests. The party moved quickly, kids chasing each other through the hallway, neighbors laughing over punch, Lily squealing as she opened presents. When it was time for cake, Margaret stepped forward and handed me the envelope with a pleasant smile. "Open it after the candles," she said. After Lily's wishes were made and the cake slices passed around, I slipped the envelope open, thinking it might be a card. Inside was a typed list, single-spaced with the title Outstanding Loans, Emma and Luke. Each line was a date and an amount. Water heater repair, $347.56. Formula, $24.99. Party supplies, $62.50. The total at the bottom was several $1,000s. The room went silent. Forks hovered in midair as I read the sheet twice to be sure. A few guests craned their necks to see. Luke gave an awkward laugh and said it must be a joke, but Margaret nodded and said she was just keeping accounts straight. No humor in her voice, just calm certainty. I folded the paper, slipped it back into the envelope, and thanked her without a word of argument. Then I tucked it into my bag and guided Lily toward the pile of gifts. The rest of the party ran on autopilot. Guests sensed the tension and kept their conversations polite but brief. When the last friend left, I stacked plates in the sink and caught Luke watching me, puzzled. That night, after Lily was asleep, Luke placed the envelope on the kitchen table. He suggested paying the amount to keep the peace. He spoke softly, as if the numbers might wake our daughter. I opened my laptop and turned the screen toward him. A spreadsheet glowed in the dim light. For months, I had logged every hour Margaret spent babysitting, along with local childcare rates. Hundreds of entries filled the columns. The total value towered over the figure on Margaret's list. Luke leaned closer, reading silently as I scrolled through rows of dates and times. I had included market rates for professional care and noted when Margaret requested extra help or extended hours. The sum of those hours exceeded her loans by thousands. I highlighted the bottom cell where the final total blinked in bold. Luke's eyebrows lifted. He sat back, processing the difference. I explained that I wasn't trying to win a contest, only to show the full picture. Without a word, he nodded, the earlier idea of repaying fading from his face. We agreed to respond calmly. Together we drafted a letter. It thanked Margaret for every bit of help and explained that we considered all debts settled. I attached a printed version of my spreadsheet, with columns for dates, start and end times, and hourly childcare rates pulled from local providers. We decided to share it at the next family dinner, not in private, so there would be no misunderstandings or quiet revisions later. Sunday arrived with a crisp sky and the smell of roasted vegetables drifting from Margaret's kitchen. Luke's father and sister were already seated when we walked in. I carried a folder with our letter and records, each page neatly clipped. Dinner passed with small talk about Lily's preschool art project and Luke's work deadlines. After dessert, I thanked Margaret for hosting and said we wanted to clarify something to keep family support transparent. I placed the folder on the table and slid it toward her. Inside was our letter and the spreadsheet. I explained each column and the totals, speaking evenly and without accusation. I pointed out how many hours she had spent caring for Lily and what that would cost through a professional service. Luke's father leaned in, scanning the figures. Luke's sister raised her eyebrows, surprised at the detailed tracking. The room quieted until only the ticking of the wall clock filled the space. Margaret kept her eyes on the first page. The confident look she usually wore began to fade. A flush crept across her cheeks. She tapped the paper once, then set it down without a word. Luke's father cleared his throat, breaking the silence. He said it was clear we had all supported each other in many ways, and that putting love on a balance sheet didn't make sense. His voice stayed gentle but firm. Luke nodded beside him, agreeing that the numbers showed everything was already balanced. Margaret glanced around the table, her lips pressed tight. She started to speak, then stopped. Her hands rested on the folder as if weighing it. Finally, she leaned back, expression unreadable. We finished tea with quiet conversation about Lily's upcoming preschool events. No one mentioned money again. When we gathered our coats, the envelope Margaret had brought to the birthday party still sat on the sideboard, forgotten. Outside, the evening air felt cool and steady. Luke squeezed my hand as we walked to the car. The folded list of outstanding loans remained in my bag, untouched. We had not raised our voices or argued, but the message was clear. Every favor had already been repaid in full, and the unspoken ledger between us was closed. The following week brought its own ripple effects. A neighbor stopped me on the sidewalk to ask about the tense dinner. Margaret had mentioned a family finance talk, but no details. I only smiled and said everything was settled. Luke called his mother midweek to check in. He kept the conversation light, focusing on Lily's upcoming preschool field trip. When he returned from the call, he said she sounded reserved but polite. Days passed without further mention of the ledger. Margaret still sent photos of her garden and asked about Lily's latest drawings. Her messages were short, almost formal, but the silence around money felt like a door quietly closing. We didn't celebrate or gloat. Instead, we kept our routines steady. Morning preschool drop-offs, weekend grocery runs, and quiet evenings with Lily's storybooks. The tension had not disappeared, but the balance sheet that hovered over every interaction had finally lost its power. I'm a 32-year-old woman, and the week after that tense Sunday dinner felt strangely quiet. Luke and I kept our routine steady, preschool drop-offs, late-night grocery runs, but there was an edge to every phone buzz. By midweek, the silence broke. Margaret called and asked us to come by for coffee the following Saturday, just to clear the air. We arrived mid-morning. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon rolls and fresh coffee. Margaret set a plate on the table and placed the folder I'd brought to dinner beside it, unopened since that night. She folded her hands and said the childcare hours I'd tallied shouldn't count because, in her words, a grandmother's time is a joy, not a service. I kept my voice even and pointed to the typed loan list she had delivered at Lily's birthday. She had recorded every grocery split, every plumbing repair, every small expense. If her help was a gift of love, then our time was too, and balancing the record was only fair. Luke's sister, who had dropped by to visit, nodded and said the numbers looked reasonable, if debts were part of the conversation at all. Margaret's lips pressed tight. After a long pause, she suggested we call it even, but she wanted a formal note of appreciation for the help she had provided. Luke declined with a calm shake of his head. Financial matters between adults didn't need ceremonial thanks, he said, especially when both sides had already contributed more than enough. Luke's father stepped in from the hallway, leaning on the doorframe. He told us all to stop putting love on a balance sheet, his voice low but firm. Margaret looked down at her coffee. The kitchen clock ticked a slow rhythm through the silence. After a few more minutes of small talk that never quite caught fire, Margaret stood and reached for her coat. She left early, the printed loan list still resting on the table. Luke carried it to the counter while I wrapped the leftover cinnamon rolls. Neither of us mentioned it on the drive home. 2 days later, I was in the front yard pruning the small herb garden when our neighbor Carla leaned over the fence. She asked if things were all right. Margaret had stopped by her house and mentioned a humiliating confrontation over family finances. Carla looked worried. I thanked her for checking and said it was handled, offering no details. Carla nodded but glanced toward Margaret's house with a sympathetic frown. Luke decided to speak directly with his mother to avoid more rumors. That evening, he drove over alone. He returned an hour later with a careful summary. He had told her we valued her deeply, but would not keep a running ledger or repay loans that were never agreed upon. He kept his tone warm, but he left no room for argument. Margaret listened without interruption, then said she needed time to think. The next day I typed a short, clear agreement. It stated that all past exchanges of money, childcare, or favors between our households were fully settled and no debts remained. I left space for signatures and the date. Luke read it, nodded once, and said it was better to put everything in writing so no one could rewrite the history later. Saturday afternoon we visited Margaret again. The sky threatened rain, and the driveway glistened with a thin mist. Inside, she set the agreement on the counter and read it twice. Her face gave nothing away. After a long minute, she reached for a pen. Her hand hovered, then moved steadily as she signed her name beneath ours. She added the date and slid the paper back across the counter. We thanked her for taking the step and agreed to keep a copy for each household. There was no hug, just a quiet exchange of nods. The air felt lighter but still cautious, like a truce that needed time to hold. From that day forward, Luke and I followed a new rule we had already discussed. We would politely decline any future financial help, no matter how small. If a pipe burst or a car tire blew, we would handle it ourselves. No shared receipts, no just this once offers. To make sure childcare never became a gray area again, we enrolled Lily in a part-time preschool program that began the following month. The registration forms were straightforward, and the schedule fit perfectly around my remote contract work. When we told Margaret about the plan, she nodded without comment. The weeks that followed revealed a subtle shift. Margaret still stopped by for Sunday dinners, but kept the visits brief and focused on Lily's artwork or school activities. She no longer offered to pick up groceries or cover small repairs. She remained polite, asking about Luke's projects and my contracts, but her usual detailed questions about household expenses were gone. One evening, she dropped off a bag of hand-me-down books for Lily and stood at the doorway instead of stepping inside. Her smile was mild, almost cautious. She complimented the garden and left before the porch light flicked on. Neighborhood chatter faded as well. Carla waved from across the street, but no longer asked quiet questions about family finances. Luke's sister visited more often, bringing her own kids to play in the backyard. She remarked on how calm the house felt now, and how Lily seemed to thrive in preschool with new friends and a set schedule. Spring rolled toward summer. Luke and I continued our quiet rhythm. Early mornings with coffee on the porch, Lily's preschool pickup at noon, weekend trips to the farmer's market. Margaret attended Lily's end-of-term recital and clapped politely from the second row. Afterward, she handed Lily a small box of daisies and said she loved watching her grow. There was no mention of money, no careful tracking of the cost of flowers or gas. The balance between us had shifted from a silent scoreboard to something steadier. Family dinners carried easy conversation about Lily's drawings and Luke's latest woodworking project. Margaret still kept her trademark neat notebook in her purse, but I noticed she never opened it at our table again. By midsummer, we hosted a casual cookout for a few neighbors and relatives. Margaret arrived with a simple salad and a soft smile. She complimented the backyard lights Luke had strung across the fence and settled into a chair beside Lily, helping her arrange plates for the guests. When the evening wound down, she thanked us for the meal and waved to the neighbors before heading home. Luke and I exchanged a quiet glance as we cleared the table. The written agreement sat in a folder in our desk drawer, signed and dated. It hadn't erased the past, but it had drawn a clear line that everyone now respected. Life didn't return to the old way, and that was fine. What replaced it was steadier, polite visits, shared moments with Lily, and no hidden tallies waiting to surface. With the boundaries set and understood, we finally felt that the unspoken calculations had ended, leaving only the simple, ordinary rhythm of family. I'm a 32-year-old woman, and life settled into a careful rhythm after Margaret signed the agreement that ended the money disputes. Sunday dinners continued, but the warmth was thinner. Margaret kept her voice polite, yet her focus drifted toward Luke whenever we visited. If I asked about her garden or her volunteer work, she answered in short sentences before turning the conversation back to him. One afternoon, she arrived at our house carrying a canvas bag of toys Lily used to play with at her place. Blocks, a stuffed rabbit, a puzzle with half the pieces worn soft from use. She said she was clearing space and thought Lily might like them. Her tone was pleasant but distant, as if she were tidying away more than just toys. A week later, Margaret invited us to a charity fundraiser at the town community center. She spoke to both of us, but her eyes lingered on Luke, and she made a point of mentioning that the neighbors expected the whole family to attend. We accepted, wanting to keep appearances cordial. The event drew a big crowd. Tables lined with silent auction items filled the hall, and music from a local band echoed under the rafters. Margaret greeted acquaintances with warm smiles and talked about Luke's woodworking projects, barely glancing my way, except for a brief nod when someone asked about Lily. While we stood near the refreshment table, a neighbor laughed and joked about Margaret's famous ledgers, claiming they had heard she kept the most detailed family accounts in town. The words carried a teasing edge that made it clear Margaret had shared her version of our dispute. I exchanged a quick look with Luke but said nothing. Luke stayed close, making sure I never stood alone in the crowd. When the evening wrapped up, he took my hand and said we would present a united front no matter what stories were floating around. We left with polite goodbyes and a quiet drive home. Lily soon started her part-time preschool program. The change brought welcome structure to our days and put childcare questions firmly in the past. At the first pickup where Margaret joined us, she watched Lily bound out of the classroom and commented that our daughter seemed too independent for her age, a remark that felt more pointed than casual. I thanked her for coming and steered Lily toward the car. A few nights later, Luke's father called me directly. His voice held a note of apology. He said he'd noticed the coolness and promised to keep upcoming gatherings civil. He didn't offer details but clearly understood the strain. The next family dinner proved tense from the start. Margaret sat at the far end of the table and limited conversation to safe topics like the weather and a new bakery downtown. Luke and I kept the meal cheerful, but the distance was obvious. During dessert, Luke's sister handed Lily a birthday gift card, even though the next birthday was months away. She joked that it came with no strings attached, earning a sharp glance from Margaret that everyone at the table caught. The air thickened until Lily began singing a preschool song and broke the silence with giggles. Work brought a welcome distraction. I secured a new contract that offered flexible hours and enough income to cover any extra childcare without leaning on family. It gave us even more independence, something Luke quietly celebrated when we signed the papers. Despite our efforts to keep things smooth, whispers reached me. A mutual friend mentioned that Margaret had told a few people I treated family like a business. The words were relayed casually, but the meaning was clear. I decided not to confront her, choosing instead to keep our boundary firm. Luke, however, didn't let it slide. The next time he visited his mother, he told her directly that the gossip needed to stop. He kept his voice calm, but left no doubt that we wouldn't tolerate stories that twisted the truth. Margaret listened without arguing, her face unreadable. A few days later, a small shift appeared. Margaret sent a brief text about Lily's upcoming preschool recital, asking for the time and offering to bring flowers. It was the first friendly outreach in weeks, short and neutral, but a sign that maybe the tension was starting to ease. Through those weeks, our household stayed steady. Lily thrived at school, Luke's projects filled the garage with the scent of fresh-cut wood, and I worked early mornings while the house was quiet. Margaret remained present, but measured, a grandmother who now kept her distance while still finding small ways to stay connected. The careful balance we had fought to create was holding, even as the subtle power plays continued just beneath the surface. I'm a 32-year-old woman, and by late November, Luke suggested we host Christmas dinner at our house to keep the mood comfortable and balanced. The idea felt right. We had more space than before after a few small renovations, and it gave us a chance to set the tone. Luke called his parents that evening. Margaret paused long enough that Luke put the phone on speaker, but then she agreed, and even joked about bringing her ledger-friendly dessert, a dry nod to the past that made us both glance at each other in surprise. From the first week of December, the house transformed. Lily helped hang paper stars on the windows and strung popcorn garlands across the mantel. I spent afternoons with flour on my apron testing cookie recipes while Luke adjusted the tree lights until they glowed evenly. The living room filled with the scent of pine and cinnamon, warm enough to soften any edges that still lingered. A week before Christmas, Margaret knocked on our door unannounced. She held a tin of cookies and wore a tentative smile. I let her in, and the house filled with the smell of butter and sugar as she set the tin on the counter. Without ceremony, she tied on one of my spare aprons and asked what she could help with. We began mixing dough for a pie, and conversation unfolded in quiet layers. While we rolled crust, she mentioned that she hoped Christmas dinner could mark a new chapter. Her voice stayed careful but genuine. We traded stories about family recipes, her mother's lemon pie, my grandmother's spice cookies, finding unexpected ease as we worked. Luke stepped in from the garage and paused at the doorway, eyebrows raised in pleasant surprise at the sight of us laughing over a cloud of flour. He gave me an encouraging glance before setting down the box of ornaments he'd been sorting. When Christmas Day arrived, snow dusted the street like powdered sugar. Relatives trickled in carrying casseroles and brightly wrapped packages. The house glowed with candles and the scent of roasted turkey. Guests admired the decorations and commented on how warm the space felt. Even Luke's sister, who had witnessed past tension, seemed relaxed as she poured hot cider into mugs. After dinner plates were cleared and dessert was served, Margaret stood with a glass of sparkling cider and offered a short toast to fresh beginnings. Her words stayed light, with no mention of money or ledgers, only a hope for more family time in the year ahead. Conversation paused, then warm applause filled the room. Luke's sister grinned and teased Margaret about her ledger dessert, prompting a ripple of laughter. To everyone's surprise, Margaret laughed along, shaking her head as if to wave away the old story. The sound eased the room even further. Later, she presented Lily with a handmade sweater in soft winter colors. No price tags, no side remarks, just a careful fit and a smile as Lily twirled in her new gift. The gesture carried more weight than any expensive present could have. When the last guests left and the house quieted, Margaret lingered by the kitchen doorway. She asked about Lily's school progress and shared ideas for family outings once spring arrived, maybe a day at the botanical gardens or a picnic at the lakeside park. Her tone stayed thoughtful, almost tentative. Before leaving, she paused and admitted she might have been too focused on numbers in the past. She said she wanted to enjoy her granddaughter without keeping score. I thanked her and told her we valued her time and love far more than anything else she could give. We hugged before she stepped into the snowy night, a warm and steady embrace that felt different from the polite goodbyes of months earlier. The door closed behind her with a quiet click, leaving the house filled with the soft glow of lights and the promise of a calmer future. It wasn't an ending to our story, just a shift, one that hinted that the long winter might finally give way to something lasting and peaceful. The new year started with a slow, steady rhythm. Snow still covered the yard when Margaret began stopping by every Saturday morning. She carried small treats for Lily, fresh muffins one week, a bundle of colorful pencils the next, and slipped into our family routine as if it had always been this calm. The visits felt natural, a gentle shift from the tense months behind us. By February, the ground softened enough to plant an herb garden. I invited Margaret to help plant it with Lily. On a bright afternoon, the three of us knelt in the soil, pressing rosemary and basil into neat rows while Luke set up a small trellis. Margaret showed Lily how to water each plant carefully, explaining how roots needed space to breathe. The yard filled with the scent of damp earth and the sound of Lily's excited chatter. Our conversations during those mornings wandered easily. We talked about favorite recipes, local craft fairs, and the best places to buy seedlings. No talk of expenses or careful accounting, just simple topics that made the hours glide by. Luke often paused at the doorway to watch, a faint smile as he listened to our voices mixing with the soft scrape of trowels. One evening, Luke thanked both of us over dinner. He said the house felt lighter and quieter now, and that he was grateful for how everyone had worked to keep it that way. Margaret nodded, her eyes warm as she passed Lily a plate of sliced apples. March brought the annual spring fair at the town square. Booths lined the sidewalks, filled with handmade jewelry, local honey, and bright paper lanterns. Margaret walked beside me as Lily skipped ahead with a cotton candy stick. When we met some of her friends from the community center, Margaret introduced me as her wonderful daughter-in-law, the words carrying a proud emphasis that caught me off guard. Her friends smiled and chatted about the garden plans and Lily's preschool adventures. As April approached, Lily's 4th birthday became the focus. Margaret offered to help decorate, but asked about every detail before making a single plan. We sat together at the kitchen table, choosing colors for streamers and balloons, trading ideas for games and snacks. Luke read through the budget we had prepared, and Margaret listened without adding a single suggestion about costs. She simply nodded and said it sounded perfect. On the day of the party, our backyard turned into a lively playground. Children chased bubbles across the grass while music played from a small speaker. Margaret helped set out trays of food and snapped candid photos of Lily blowing out candles, her laughter carrying above the chatter. There were no quiet calculations behind her eyes, only an easy smile as she balanced paper plates and passed out slices of cake. When the gifts were opened, Margaret handed Lily a carefully wrapped package. Inside was a scrapbook filled with photos of their time together, gardening afternoons, storybook nights, and quiet walks to the park. Each page had handwritten captions with dates and small drawings in the corners. It was a simple, heartfelt present that made Lily beam and flip through the pages again and again. Before the guests left, Luke's sister gathered everyone for a family portrait in the garden. We stood beneath the trellis with its new shoots of green while the camera clicked. Luke later printed and framed the photo, hanging it in the living room where morning light catches it each day. In the weeks after the party, neighbors began to comment on the change they saw. During a walk to the market, a friend mentioned how close our family looked now, saying the tension from last year seemed to have vanished. It wasn't just a polite remark. People noticed the difference. Luke's father pulled me aside one evening while helping fix a loose fence post. He said he admired how I had handled everything, keeping boundaries firm without letting bitterness grow. His quiet words carried more weight than a long speech. When the house emptied after the birthday celebration, Luke and I lingered in the kitchen with leftover cake. We talked about how far we had come since the days of hidden ledgers and silent standoffs. The clear lines we set had made all the difference, giving everyone space to meet in the middle without pressure. A few days later, a card arrived in the mail. Margaret had written a short note in careful script. "Thank you for making me feel welcome and for letting me share these moments with Lily. I love you all very much." Inside, she had slipped a small photo from the party, a candid shot of Lily hugging her. No price tag, no tally, just a simple gift of memory. The framed family portrait now hangs in the living room, a quiet reminder of how a household once strained by careful accounting found a new rhythm. The garden outside grows thicker each week, herbs pushing green shoots toward the sun. Margaret visits on Saturdays. Lily rushes to show her the latest blooms, and the air holds only the sounds of everyday life, steady, warm, and free of old calculations. Spring unfolded with a steady rhythm. Margaret began arriving on scheduled afternoons, always at the same time, carrying a light sweater and a smile. Lily raced to meet her at the gate, and the two of them wandered through the herb garden, checking the growth of the rosemary and basil. I set out tea on the back porch while Luke trimmed the hedges. Conversations drifted easily across the table, recipes, neighborhood events, small updates from the preschool. The visits felt calm, with no hint of the ledgers that once shadowed every interaction. May brought Lily's preschool graduation. The small ceremony filled the community hall with folding chairs and handmade decorations. Margaret sat near the front, camera ready. She snapped photos as Lily received a paper diploma, capturing the bright cap perched crookedly on her granddaughter's head. Afterward, we all posed for group pictures, Margaret standing proudly beside Luke and me as parents and neighbors applauded. As summer warmed the yard, I suggested a family picnic at the large park near the river. Margaret accepted with quick enthusiasm. We planned the menu together at our kitchen table, each of us writing dishes on a shared list. Luke added a note for drinks and paper plates while Lily chimed in with a request for watermelon slices. No one mentioned costs. The list simply divided itself by who liked to cook what. On the Saturday of the picnic, the park buzzed with families flying kites and tossing frisbees. Our group spread blankets beneath a white oak tree. Margaret brought her famous lemon pie, Luke grilled skewers, and I arranged a platter of fresh fruit. Neighbors stopped by to say hello, joining in the laughter and games. Lily ran barefoot across the grass while Margaret relaxed on the blanket, sunglasses shading her eyes as she watched the children chase bubbles. Later in the afternoon, Luke's father lifted a cup of lemonade and offered a simple toast to family harmony, smiling at how far everyone had come. The words drew easy cheers without a single glance back at past arguments. It felt like the quiet celebration of something earned. That evening, after the dishes were packed and Lily slept, Luke and I sat on the porch. We agreed to keep the standing rule we'd made long ago, accept help only when it is freely offered, never as a loan. The rule didn't need repeating often, but we both liked to acknowledge it now and then, a private commitment to the balance we had built. As August approached, we planned a small dinner for Margaret's birthday. Lily helped wrap a handmade photo album we had assembled, each page filled with snapshots from the garden, the spring fair, and the picnic by the river. On the evening of the celebration, the house glowed with candles as we served a simple meal of roast chicken and summer vegetables. After dinner, we presented the album. Margaret opened it slowly, fingertips tracing the edges of each photograph. She lingered on a picture of Lily hugging her at the spring fair, eyes soft with surprise and pleasure. She turned page after page, smiling quietly at the memories gathered without a single receipt attached. Over dessert, conversation grew thoughtful. Margaret admitted she once believed love needed to be tallied to be sure it was real. She spoke of the old habit of recording every favor and expense, then paused and said she had learned to value time spent together far more than any entry in a notebook. The room stayed warm and still as her words settled between us. I thanked her for choosing a more open way of sharing family life and told her how much we appreciated her steady presence. Luke added that the house felt peaceful because everyone respected each other's boundaries and intentions. Margaret nodded, her eyes bright, and reached across the table to squeeze my hand. After the plates were cleared, we wandered outside into the soft night. Fireflies flickered over the garden while the scent of basil filled the air. Margaret and I walked the path between the herb rows, talking about Lily's upcoming school year and plans for the next round of plantings. The evening carried the easy quiet of people who trust the ground beneath them. Before she left, we gathered for a quick family photo beneath the porch light. Luke set the timer and hurried to join us. The camera captured a natural smile from each of us, the kind that comes without effort. Later, when we looked at the picture, the difference from the tense gatherings of a year ago was striking. No stiff postures, no forced expressions, just a family at ease. As autumn approached, the days shortened and the garden's colors deepened. Margaret continued her scheduled visits. Lily started kindergarten with bright new notebooks, and Luke and I kept our porch coffees at dawn. There was no grand ending, no final turning point, only the steady comfort of a family that had learned to live without ledgers, measuring love in shared afternoons and small lasting moments of respect.